appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about Millican. I'm not a historian, but I do have an interest in the past, and we do, as was mentioned, we own some property in the Millican area, which figures in the history of Millican. In Brazos County, we are blessed with a number of highly talented sources for historical facts, and among those, I've consulted for assistance our historian Bill Page out at A&M, author Glenn Davis, and Henry Mayo of the Brazos County Historical Commission, and thanks to all of you. As we discuss the history of this area, what I'd like to do is ask you to join me in a pictorial history, more or less snapshots in time. The pictures that you'll see are scenes that you might walk past, might talk about, and they don't follow the text. In other words, the pictures are not of the text. They're things you might see while we're talking about the history of Millican. The pictures are grouped by old structures, including one which may be the oldest standing house in Brazos County. Goes back to 1830 to 1836. There's pictures of a cemetery, ancient trails, a quarry, abandoned railroads, and their beautiful old trestles, and lastly, a potpourri of items that I hope you'll find interesting. Again, keep in mind that the graphics are not tied to the text. Rather, they are things you might observe on our walk as we verbally stroll through time. During the next little while, I'd like to share with you some of the area's early history, how the Millican community was formed, the old days and the glory days, with the coming of the railroad, Millican's role in the war between the states, and the decline of Millican following the extension of the rails north. We'll close with a couple of interesting local stories. Yes, ma'am. You've had a preview. Millican is truly a jewel in the historic crown of Brazos County. Agricultural center, northern terminus of the Houston and Texas Central Railroad in the early 1860s, birthplace of such institutions as the former First National Bank and St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, now of Bryan. Additionally, depending upon what source you use, Millican at one point in history was one of the two largest cities in Texas, or from another source, the largest city in Texas north of Galveston, Houston, and Harrisburg. Millican was the first settlement with the first newspaper, the first school in Brazos County. Millican was also a source of rock for the Galveston jetties, both before and after the disastrous hurricane of 1900. Among the several retail giants that had roots in Millican, one was started by Lehman Sanger, a German immigrant who arrived in Millican with $300 for goods and rented half a storeroom for $5 a month. The store grew, moved north with the railroad, and became Sanger Harris of Dallas. Eventually, it was bought by Federated Department Stores, and I believe we're all familiar with Macy's. Another related story, this is unverified, but it was said that one of the buyers for Langer Harris, Herbert Marcus, would later join in business with his brother-in-law, a Mr. Neiman, and the rest is history. There were two ancient trails that played key roles in Millican's history. The first and best known is El Camino Real, the Royal Road, also known as the Old San Antonio Road or OSR. Coming north from Mexico City, it crossed the Rio Grande, the Nueces and Frio rivers, San Antonio River. Then continuing east, the trail crossed the Guadalupe, Colorado. Then approaching our area, crossed the Brazos, Navasota rivers, forming the northern boundary of Brazos County. Progressing eastward, the trail crossed the Trinity, the Natchez, and finally Sabine rivers. The second path, much less known, was La Bahia, the Bay Trail, which started at Matagorda Bay and tended to parallel the old San Antonio Road. La Bahia Trail crossed the Brazos River just south of its confluence with the Navasota River, thus marking an area just south of the boundary of Brazos County. The trail continued east across the Trinity and Natchez River and joined the OSR at the Sabine River. There were numerous cross and side trails. One of them might have been the route now followed by FM 159 into the Brazos Bottom. The area where La Bahia Trail crossed the Brazos River became known as La Bahia Crossing, then La Bahia Settlement, and later Washington on the Brazos and Old Washington. In the early 1820s, there were a number of significant events which affected Millican. Colonists from the east were now arriving at La Bahia Settlement. An early settler, Andrew Robinson, established a ferry across the Brazos River. Mexico declared independence from Spain, and Stephen F. Austin received his first and second grants of land. It was also during this period that there was an event better described as a major disagreement between two families of colonists, the Holland family and the Millicans. The Millicans were from an old and well-established Southern family, and they were not accustomed to having their decisions questioned. Legend has it that a fight between the Hollands and the Millicans occurred in La Bahia Settlement, and happened on the first day that the Millicans arrived. It seems that William and Francis Holland and their 6 sons contested the claim of Robert Millican and his 9 sons and 1 daughter to property at the junction of the Brazos and Navasota rivers. Josiah H. Bell, the acting justice of the peace, was able to control the trouble, and after a few casualties, extracted agreements from both clans that the Hollands would settle east of the Navasota River and the Millicans would settle to the west. There was a key. This was a key development in the shaping of Millican and the Brazos County. In 1831, one of Robert Millican's sons, Elliot, or E.M. Millican, he was known as the father of Millican, he was granted 2 sitios of land by the Mexican government. The sitio is said to be equal to a league, so that 2 sitios would be the equivalent of nearly 8,900 acres. 1837 marked the year of the original Millican settlement, and the location is believed to have been between 2 and 3 miles south of where the community is now. The population during this time was reported to have been 45 families. Now, Brazos County was originally part of Washington County, and the county seat was at a settlement called Mount Vernon, a short way from present-day Brenham. The settlers east of Brazos River found it difficult to get back and forth to Mount Vernon, so in 1841 a separate area was defined between the Brazos and Navasota rivers and named Navasota County. The next year, 1842, the area was renamed Brazos County. Millican was an obvious choice for the county seat. However, Texas law specified that the county seats had to be within 5 miles of the geographic center of the county. A selection committee designated a square 150-acre tract along Carter Creek and Boonville became the county seat. This site is generally along Highway 6 in the vicinity of where the Bryan Chevrolet dealership is now located. Now a few words about railroads. In 1848, the Galveston and Red River Railroad was formed. As a result of mergers and buyouts, it later became the Houston and Texas Central Railroad, the Texas Central, the Central Railroad, the Central, Texas and New Orleans, Southern Pacific, and we know it now as the Union Pacific. Regardless of the name, the right-of-way has been essentially in the same place where it is now and been there for over 150 years. As the railroad progressed north from the Gulf Coast, its management approached Washington on the Brazos, seeking $11,000 for running the right-of-way through that settlement. The railroad was turned down because the community felt that their future was in the steamship business, then operating on the Brazos River. The railroad next approached the community of Anderson, which also declined for the reason that they thought the locomotives would frighten their mules and farmhands. Finally, Mr. James Nolan, a reported squatter on property which would later become Navasota, donated the needed land. Elliott Millican sold a portion of his land grant to the railroad for a town site, and the railroad crossed the Navasota River and headed for the new and the present site of Millican. 151 years ago, on April the 12th of 1861, and 10 days before the tracks arrived in Millican, had come an event which started the war between the states, the attack on Fort Sumter. Work on the northern extension of the railroad ceased. 81 miles of track had been completed. The 6 to 7 day trip by wagon south to Harrisburg and Houston now took 7 hours. Millican was now the railhead, the end of track, and the country was at war. The town rapidly changed from a quiet farming community, cattle, corn, cotton, to a rustling frontier wartime city and rail center. The next 4 years would see Millican boom. Estimates of the peak population during this period ranged from 1,500 to 3,000, 3,000 to 6,000. One estimate says 8,000. It all depends on what reference you use. All the goods and personnel, including troops and material, moving by rail from the Texas Gulf Coast and Central Texas, probably came through Millican. Warehouses, lumber yards, livery stables, wagon repair shops, all the supporting infrastructure, cafes, saloons, lodging, stores, they all had to be there. And Millican was truly part of the Wild West. A short railroad story I found took place in Millican, close to where FM 2154, the Welborn Road, and FM 159 cross. Recall there's a four-way stop there. This tale came from a Houston Post story written in 1963, 100 years after the incident occurred. The story goes like this. On December 14, 1859, the Houston and Texas Central Railroad purchased land from Dr. Elliott Millican and established the settlement of Millican as a working camp for the railroad. The Irish laborers working on the railroad are given credit for producing much of the excitement in the camp. The Irishmen were full of play and often depended upon another person's discomfort to provide their pleasure. It was this same playfulness that prompted 5 of them to repeatedly blow out a lamp the foreman was using for light to write a letter. The foreman was not in a playful mood that evening, and finally he had his fill. He borrowed a gun, went to the small section house where the Irishman had gone to bed, stepped in and began to fire. He killed all 5 of the men, then promptly left town. Residents of Millican say that when the section house was torn apart a few years ago, that would have been in 1960, that bullets were found in the walls and dried blood remained between the boards of the double floor. Here was a vivid reminder of the days when Little Millican was referred to as Six-Shooter Junction. Historian Bill Page describes some of the war-related activities that went on in Millican. As might be expected, Millican was home to a number of military facilities. There was a shoe factory run by the Army and staffed by members of the 2nd Texas Infantry. There's also evidence of a factory making flour barrels for the Confederacy. At the outbreak of war, Millican was one of the 2 Texas locations selected by Governor Clark for establishing Army infantry camps. The other location was Victoria. Millican also remained a popular location for troops to temporarily camp, in part because the railroad afforded rapid access to the coast. Military dispatches note that troops stationed in Millican were far enough inland to avoid being surprised by a sudden enemy attack, and because the railroad, they could reach the coast within 60 hours of the first landing of hostile forces. There were at least 3 named Army camps in Millican. The first was Camp Speight, S-P-E-I-G-H-T. This location was named after Colonel J.W. Speight, commander of the 15th Texas Infantry. And among the men who were stationed there were Reverend Rufus C. Burleson, later president of Baylor University, and Captain Richard Koch, who later served as Texas governor. The second camp was Camp Raguet, R-A-G-U-E-T. This camp was named after Major Henry M. Raguet, who died in combat at Glorieta Pass, New Mexico. Among the troops who were stationed at that site were the 4th Texas Infantry, the 4th Texas Cavalry, and that was part of Hood's brigade. The third camp was called Camp Brazos, which we found several references to it, but about which we know little. We've also found mention of a Camp Crockett, located in the area somewhere, but this was it a separate camp? Was it another name for one of the already established camps? We just don't know. It's difficult to estimate how many Confederate soldiers passed through Millican. At various times in 1863, for example, companies from at least 15 different cavalry regiments and battalions passed through the town. And the Millican camps were not highly organized. They didn't have permanent structures. In November 1862, a private, later Sergeant A.B. Peticolas, wrote the following in his diary. "We started early this morning and reached Millican in due season, and from there we soon reached our regimental camp on a little slope toward the south in the midst of post oaks. We found out very little about the grasses, and we were concerned because our animals were grass-fed. We camped about where Speight's regiment had camped. The remains of their old camp are plentiful. Horse troughs and tables rudely made of puncheons laid across poles supported by forks driven firmly into the ground, a puncheon being a split log with a flat surface up to be used as a table. The arrival of soldiers in Millican must have been quite a sight. In October 1861, a letter from one soldier from Hill County starts out, "We passed through the town of Boonville and camped near the railroad." And when I first read that reference, the question immediately came to mind that if history tells us that the railroad ceased its northern expansion at Millican in April of 1861, then how could a soldier make an entry in his diary in October of 1861 that he camped near the railroad just after passing through Boonville? Historian Bill Page came to the rescue. It seems that the Houston and Texas Central Railroad had actually cleared the land, built a roadbed, and placed ties at least as far as where Bryan is now, possibly as far as Hearn. And that's when construction stopped because of the war. It would appear that our soldier camped near a right-of-way under construction rather than a completed railroad track. But back to the Hill County soldier's diary. On the following morning, before aurora dawned, all were on the march, every company striving to be first, when several companies mistook the road. When they found it out, they came back at the top of their speed, and such charging through the timber and confusion I never witnessed before. But they could not gain their former position, and had to fall in at the rear. When near Millican, we fired 2 salutes to warn them of our approach. The regiment was then formed in a solid column of 4s and marched through the town with banners unfurled and arms presented. We crossed the Navasota River that evening. The war was over in 1865. Disease struck Millican first in the form of cholera in 1866, and then with yellow fever in 1867. In a letter from Bryan, Bryan City, as Bryan was known then, published in the Galveston Daily News, October 2nd of 1867, the following was reported. The fever is very bad at Millican and very fatal. There have been some 30 deaths in that place in the last 10 days. There are now not enough left to bury the dead. Now let me say that again. There are not enough left to bury the dead. I'm glad to say that Mr. Ed Terrell, the efficient conductor of the Texas Central Railroad, has entirely recovered. The post office at Millican is now discontinued. The postmaster has fled to the woods, and the telegraph operator is dead. Later, an article in the Houston Post gave an example of the tragedy. There is a story told around Millican that a man riding horseback from town one Saturday about dusk stopped on the road and exchanged greetings with a neighbor family of 5 that was sitting on the front porch of their home. The next morning, on the way to church, the man saw the family on the porch again. When no greeting was returned in answer to his own, the man investigated. The entire family of 5 had died of the fever overnight. By 1867, steel had become available and the railroad had built north through Bryan City. Many of the stores and other structures in Millican had been physically cut into pieces, loaded on flat cars, and transported to Bryan City. Calvert, Bremont, Corsicana, and points north. Thus ended the boom area and started Millican's long decline. Let me close with a couple of stories about Millican I think you'll find interesting. Mr. L.M. Thompson, who owned property along Henderson Road in Millican, told this story of a Methodist baptism. The preacher was a circuit rider and came to Millican only occasionally. At the end of one of his infrequent services, a number of people he had converted went to a convenient place along the Brazos River for the baptism. The preacher waded out into the water to a depth suitable. A teenage girl followed him. She was to be the first in a long line of people to be baptized. The girl was in the hands of the preacher, and as he dipped her gently under the water, she slipped out of his grasp and did not come up. Time passed. Then the preacher, looking skyward, announced in a loud voice, "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away." The preacher then turned and said, "Next." The guess what? that long line of people waiting to be baptized had totally disappeared. It was not known whether an alligator caught the girl or whether a whirlpool sucked her under, but she was never found. Lastly, let me tell you about one of the most gruesome of the many Wild West stories to come out of Millican. It occurred on April the 9th of 1896, and I'd like to caution you it's a little bit graphic. The players are as follows. The players are Mr. John Brooks, about 50 years of age, father of 8, a widower, and powder man at the Millican Quarry. Miss Molly Brooks, Mr. Brooks' only daughter, and at the Millican Quarry, and her age was 22, and she was young and beautiful. The third person was a Mr. Arthur Worrell. He was age 23 and an engineer at the quarry, and he was also Molly's suitor. Mr. Brooks was adamant that his daughter Molly should remain single and help take care of the family. This version of the tragedy appeared in the April 10th, 1896 edition of the Dallas Morning News. Millican, Brazos County, Texas, April 9th. A horrible crime was enacted at the depot today. As the northbound passenger train hove up at 2 o'clock, the incident beggars description. Arthur Worrell, a young man, engineer at the Green and Oliver, that's the Millican Dunlap Quarry, and Miss Molly Brooks, the only daughter of Old Man Brooks and powder man at the quarry, came to town just before arrival of the train and purchased tickets for Bryan, where they expected to be married. In a cloud of smoke and steam, the train pulled up to the depot and stopped. Just as the young lady climbed the car's steps and reached the car's platform, she was shot from the opposite side of the car, the ball taking effect in the right breast and inflicting a fatal wound. Mr. Worrell had assisted her on the train and was on the top step of the car when the shot was fired. The young lady fell back into his arms and said, "Oh my God, Arthur, Papa has killed me." Mr. Worrell stepped back, and while laying the dead girl down, he was shot in the throat, inflicting a dangerous wound. The girl never spoke after the first exclamation and was evidently dead when she reached the station platform. Parties from the quarry say that the old man was very angry when he left with his .44 Colts Winchester, swearing he would do that which he did. After the shooting, he returned to the quarry, told some of the residents of his bloody work, then went to the powder magazine, got 20 dynamite cartridges, went 150 yards south of the store and within 50 yards of his residence, where 7 of his motherless children were asleep. He laid down on the dynamite and touched off the fuse that sent his soul to meet that of his only girl, whom he, in a moment of madness, had robbed of life. Only a few pieces of him were left. Both feet, his head, a small piece of his spinal column were picked up within 200 yards from the place of the explosion. His hat, both pants pockets, were found 150 yards away. The ground for at least 200 yards was literally covered with bits and pieces of his flesh and bones. Brooks leaves a family of 7 boys. The youngest is 6 years old. We believe we've found the location of the store that is mentioned in this incident, and we have found, we believe, the spot within a few yards where the explosion took place. There is a wealth of historical information about Millican available, and much yet to be uncovered. Stories of the war years, as told by soldiers' letters home, tales of the building of the railroad and the law and order in this frontier town, and rumors of gold and vast buried treasure from the days of the Spaniards. One particular area of interest is the gauge of the railroad tracks. That is the distance between the inside edges of the rails. In 1862, the Texas standard gauge was 5 feet 6 inches. That same year, Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act establishing the standard gauge at 5 feet. Now, if that's true, and it is, then how did American railroads end up with a gauge of 4 feet 8 1/2 inches? The gauge doesn't matter a whole lot to the passengers of the freight, but it does have impact on the engineer and the conductor. Those are just a few of the fascinating stories, and we'll leave those for another time and another speaker.